All right, we're recording. Hi, Evelyn. Okay, so what we're going to do, you want to have the writing section of your notebook out, and then as I'm doing this sort of think aloud, pretending that I'm the student who's receiving the prompt and how I would go about answering this question, you want to write down in the writing section of your notebook what you need to do to make a good plan. What are questions I'm asking myself? What is my process? Because what you want to do, again, is not focus so much on the content of what I'm getting at, because there's a number of ways to answer this question well, right? But what you want to do is get it so that, you've already tried this plan, you've already tried this prompt, planning out this prompt, but tonight's homework is planning out another prompt. So what can you learn today about how to plan well, how to think about a prompt, how to approach a prompt, how to make sure that your plan actually matches the prompt and responds to the prompt, and what are questions that I'm asking myself in my planning process, figuring out while you're planning rather than trying to figure out everything while you're writing. So what we're going to do is take questions at the end, because in real life you wouldn't be interrupting my planning process asking a question about something. So again, I'm going to try to make it just like I would if I were the student trying to plan out this question. So the first thing is obviously to read the prompt carefully. In retrospect, the reader often discovers that the first chapter of a novel or the opening scene of a drama introduces some of the major themes of the work. Write an essay about the first chapter of Lord of the Flies in which you explain how the opening scene or chapter introduces the meaning of the work as a whole. Now, I can see that my teacher so kindly already underlined the important concepts, right, in the prompt. Now, ideally, you'd be able to see that, this is really what we need to focus on, right? How the opening scene or chapter illuminates or introduces the meaning of the work as a whole, which of course, again, it's about the connection between these two concepts. So I can't just think about this, and I can't just think about this, but I have to see sort of how they connect. If I don't establish that connection, then I'm not really answering the question. So now I'm going to think, what is a way to approach this? I see two clear ways to approach this. I can either start by naming some themes, right? And again, how do we name a theme? We answer the question, what is Golding trying to teach us through his story in Lord of the Flies? What is he arguing here? What does a reader learn by reading this book, right? So we can't leave it at the topic level. You can't say there's this topic of leadership. No, he's not teaching us leadership. The question is, what is he teaching us about leadership? So I could start by articulating some themes and kind of going from there, kind of working backwards. Or, because I'm allowed to use my book, I could kind of thumb through the first chapter. Or if I couldn't use my book, what can I remember from the first chapter that has some sort of hint at one of the themes? Now, being that I can use my book, I'm going to go ahead and kind of thumb through chapter 1. Right? And even when it comes to using my book, assuming that this, again, is under time circumstances, I don't have time to reread the chapter. So what am I going to do? I'm going to look at my annotations. Good thing I annotated. Because now I've got something to look at, rather than just words, right? Now I've got phrases. Oh, look, screwed up eyes. That looks like a good one. Because that gets into the idea of, illusion and reality, and that could be something that I might be able to get into. Not that that's necessarily, it's not the meaning of the work, but the idea of screwed up eyes. We talked quite a bit about, the three blind mice, and what are they blind to, and what does that mean, and notions of illusion and reality. So what else do I have annotated here? Got quite a bit about, there's tree trunks falling, Ralph keeps falling. We talked about how that could be an allusion to the fall of man in the Garden of Eden. The plane crash in and of itself, right? Sort of an indicator that that's an illusion. Again, I'm not necessarily talking about the second part. I'm actually going to leave this half of the page kind of clear to make sure I eventually get there. I'm just thinking about how some little details kind of fit into bigger conversations. That doesn't mean I've necessarily like articulated a theme yet. I see on page 5 that there's quite a bit that I noticed the first time reading where Golding personifies nature. Get into the power of nature there. Maybe I might get into the idea of Mother Nature and sort of nature as a feminine force. Or maybe I won't. I don't know. Let's see what else we got here. Page 6, I've got underlined, the fact that the boys are 12 years old, which sort of signals that this is a coming-of-age story. That could be a nice way to enter into the conversation of, like, what does Golding think? What is the difference between a child and adult? How does one come of age? How does Golding answer that question with this book, I can think about. I see on page 7, that's where, despite Piggy saying, please don't call me this, Ralph sort of announces to the whole group that his name is Piggy. We see this idea of the boys unifying against Piggy, unifying against sort of this victim or outcast, and that there could be something dangerous about unifying, that unification can, I know obviously from other books, it has the potential to be a really positive force, but at the same time, I think with Golding, we see some of the dangers of this sort of unification there. What else do we see? Ooh, on page 8, this would kind of work up here, I think, where Ralph looks into the lagoon and doesn't see his reflection. He sees to the bottom, but it's like he doesn't see himself clearly yet. That feels like it's a connection sort of at this point, but it might also be a connection to this point of the notion of coming of age, or what it might eventually get into. What else? We've got Piggy as the voice of reason, right? Where he's the one who says we might die here. That might have something to do with illusion and reality, but it might not. Kind of depends on what I eventually go with, I think. I'm just going to write myself a little note so that I remember kind of my line of thinking there. What else do we have? Blurred sunlight up here that sort of goes with the notion of not seeing clearly. Oh, they find the conch. Get into some sort of leadership conversation. Now, is this where they talk about that, like, the rule of the conch, or is that in another chapter? I need to keep looking. I don't know if this is where it gets into the notion of, like, the right of the individual, or maybe not yet. Maybe that's a later chapter. Oh yeah. So this is the chapter where someone's like individual shadow is compared to a bat. This is also where when like Ralph is squinting and looking and he sees, he doesn't realize he's seeing the choir, but he described like Golding describes the choir as a creature moving. This feels like it's getting into the notion of like the beast is within the boys. That Golding is sort of hinting at it straight away in chapter 1. That could be something good to talk about. Sun blindness. Quite a bit of blindness already in chapter 1. I think also, actually with this, with the whole notion of like coming of age, I remember, it's in here somewhere, but I don't remember where it is. When Jack is looking for the man with the megaphone, right? And there's like that whole moment where he's like, oh, you're just a boy? I thought there was an adult here, you're not an adult. And so there's already this sort of clear question as what it means to be an adult, what it means to be a kid. And that's when he gets into like, I want to be called Mary Do because that's an adult name. What else? Ooh, the toy of voting. Again, the notion of sort of how leadership works, what he's teaching us about leadership. We see Ralph trying to share some leadership. Ooh, this is where we also get into the idea of like the game, right? Like the game of exploring, and then it sort of blurs into real exploring. Games as an illusion. What else do we have? Ooh. I just got excited because I saw the word glamour and it reminded me of glamour of adulthood, but it's not glamour of adulthood here. There's mirages. I'm seeing quite a bit, noticing there's quite a bit of that in chapter 1. What else? Just pause and reflect for one moment. Now you see that if I only had 50 minutes to write an essay, I'm spending quite a bit of time in my book, and I feel like time is starting to get away from me. I would make sure, if this were actually a test, I would be looking at the time and only giving myself a certain amount of time in the book. Again, a lot of times students feel really good when they're allowed to use a book, but the problem is this is what ends up happening sometimes, is that you spend so much time with your nose in the book, and it's a lot of this we know. Like, I know most of this. I guess I'm excited because I've got page numbers next to it, but that's not going to improve my essay. Another thing is that, just slightly off topic, just to pause on this for just one moment, is that sometimes when students use the book, they not only spend so much time with their nose in the book, but then they also don't study. So hopefully, again, what you're seeing is that you need to be really careful about your time when you're allowed to use your book. You have to be even more careful about your time, because you can get all into looking at the book, and then you sort of start to lose focus sometimes, or definitely lose time. So with that being said, I'm going to speed this part up, because we've got a lot of great ideas, but I'm not going to be using all of them. So I'm going to try to get this moving. Now this is the part in chapter 1, they find like Simon's special little place. We get the candle buds. I remember in class we talked about like different ways that they treat nature, the ways that they treat the environment. And that kind of connects with the idea of like personifying nature. Maybe there's some sort of connection there. I think I could argue that Golding is trying to teach us something about how to treat nature, as nature sort of, again, feels like the feminine force, like almost a character in the book. Here's where we also have the enormity of killing the pig, of almost killing the pig. And now I finally got to the end of chapter 1. I think ideally we would have gone a little bit faster. I would have gone a little bit faster with that. Now, just off the top of my head, meanings of the work, well, seeing as I studied, the two that we definitely got to that one day when I said, what do you think Golding is trying to teach us? And we sort of refined what we did there. We talked about the idea of that our capacity for evil and brutality is part of human nature. And we talked about the idea of trying to get sort of two concepts within a single articulation, that's something that can sort of help develop the idea. We also talked about the civilized world as a type of veneer. Let me spell it. Here we go. As a type of veneer that creates a false sense of security and propriety. So those are some possibilities to just kind of keep in mind floating around. But I think what I want to do, I'm really interested in getting at the notion, I'm excited about talking about this. I think that makes a lot of sense. And there's so much about this idea in chapter 1 So to me, this, the idea of like seeing clearly, and I think part of what Golding's getting at is that we need to see that we ourselves have that capacity for evil, and that it's seeing clearly. And that's part of that, right? The idea of the book as a coming of age story. That seeing clearly one's capacity for evil is what makes a person an adult rather than a child. Seeing clearly one's capacity for evil is the distinction, that's better, between an adult and a child. Okay, got rid of the wordiness. There were too many words. It was getting, again, like, rather than one really good, like, tight cotton ball, it was like spreading out the cotton ball and making it longer and longer to the point where you can't even use the cotton ball anymore. So I kind of cleaned it up a little bit because articulating the point that you're going to prove, articulating the theme is I think one that's worth spending that time on. So, okay. So I've got my 3 body paragraphs. Not that it has to be 3, but it can be, and that they all contribute to this theme, right? Which you could argue is the meaning of the work. Seeing clearly one's capacity for evil is the distinction between an adult and a child, right? So coming of age, that sort of comments on the adult and child part of the sentence. Illusion and reality, that creates this part of the sentence. And then the idea of the beast is within the boys, that gets into capacity for evil. So what's good about this is I'm seeing that my articulation of the theme, I need to analyze these 3 elements in order to prove this theme. Because this doesn't prove the whole thing. This doesn't prove the whole thing. This proves part of it, proves part of it, proves part of it. So now the body paragraphs need each other in order to prove the point. So I've got a lot of examples. I've got some stuff to talk about. I've got my main point, or I've articulated my theme. Now that being said, I'm not done yet. Because part of the plan is to figure out what order makes the most sense to present these ideas. And then I also still need to articulate, like, what point am I proving in each paragraph? Because I don't want to say, talk about how it's a coming-of-age book. Talk about the motif of illusion and reality. If I just say talk about it, it's going to be really easy to fall into summary. So I need to articulate what am I proving in each paragraph. But before I do that, I want to figure out the order. Because I already have an idea, but I already have sort of written down. I just need to articulate it so that I can use it as my topic sentences to make it really clear for my reader. Now, as I'm looking at this, I feel like I want to start here, because I think what I'm actually getting into here, actually sort of the playground politics I could also get into here. I was looking at, sort of thinking about how they treat Piggy. That's part of the whole, they're not children, they're not adults, they're this weird in between. So it's really getting at, how does Golding use characterization? Right, that's really what he's getting at. I think I'm going to start with this one, because it feels like it's pretty general to most 12-year-olds. Like, it's not really anything specific to the story yet, and because it's the most general and sort of, to me, obvious that he's pointing to a coming-of-age story because of the age of the boys and sort of how he describes them, But that feels like a good sort of starting point, so I can get more insightful and more in depth as I go, and more specific. Now, what makes more sense to go with next? That the beast is within the boys, or this sort of tension of illusion and reality? And I think this makes more sense because it gets into the idea of setting up that they don't see themselves clearly, whereas this hints at how to see yourself clearly. That there's like hints in the beginning that this is what they really are, but they don't see it yet. Which means I feel like I need to create the illusion before busting it with the reality. So that's the order, okay, that's the order I'm gonna go with. I see how all of the parts are necessary in order to prove my main point. So I've written a little big here, so I'm just gonna get a second sheet of paper here just so I can have the rest of my plan that I definitely need to do. Obviously, I am gonna need to articulate a thesis at some point, but I don't do that until the end, because I wanna make sure everything else lines up so that I can really think about, so ultimately, what is it that I'm proving here? So body paragraph 1. I know I need the word characterization in it. I know I need to point to the idea of coming of age, or the distinction between an adult and a child. Golding uses characterization again, I need to connect it to this idea. Uses characterization to introduce question. What it means Golding uses characterization to introduce the question of what it means to become an adult. It's not perfect, but time, circumstances, gotta move on. What's good about it is I'm articulating my point. It's clear that this is a paragraph on characterization, and it also gets into what it contributes to that overall idea. So it does what it needs to do. Body paragraph 2. Okay, so I'm thinking about this idea of not seeing clearly, of setting up this idea of illusion and reality, so that ultimately it's the idea that the boys do not see themselves clearly. So maybe by setting up the motif of illusion and reality, comma, Golding hints that boys do not see, or understand. It's really about understanding. Do not understand themselves clearly. Because it's not about, I mean, The idea of showing that they literally don't see clearly is to help us understand the idea that they don't understand things clearly. So I want to make it clear that I'm really getting to the understanding part and not so much the literal part, but what do we glean from the literal? Okay. So this is where I'm going to talk about sort of his use of comparisons. How does he use comparisons to get, and this was a capacity for evil. Seeing clearly one's capacity for evil is the distinction, seeing clearly one's capacity for evil is the distinction between an adult and a child. It still feels clunky to me, but I gotta keep going. Okay, seeing clearly one's capacity for evil is a distinction between an adult and a child. That's what Golding argues. Okay, so Golding uses comparison to reveal the reality that the boys have a capacity for evil. Golding uses comparisons to, I'm going to say, begin to expose the beastly nature of the boys. Yes. Okay. So here's what I like about the way I just worded that. Because I wanted to get into the idea of capacity for evil and the idea that what they're being compared to is the beast here. Not that we have the term beast yet, but the idea of comparing them to like bats and some like, you know, indefinable creature that he's beginning it, right? He's like throwing the seeds to that idea. Golding uses comparisons to begin to expose the beastly nature of the boys. It tightens up some connections there that would take 8 more words if I didn't articulate it in this way. All right, now, Golding uses characterization to introduce the question of what it means to become an adult. By setting up the motif of illusion or reality, Golding hints that the boys do not understand themselves clearly. Golding uses comparisons to begin to expose the beastly nature of the boys. Again, I've got like what I'm analyzing, and then ultimately how it gets to the theme. So now I gotta get my thesis. Now, before I do my thesis, I'm gonna reread the prompt, because that's gonna help me. In retrospect, the reader often discovers that the first chapter of a novel or the opening scene of a drama introduces some of the major themes of the work. Write an essay about the first chapter, Lord of the Flies, in which you explain how the opening scene or chapter introduces the meaning of the work as a whole. Maybe I'll go by employing characterization, motif, and comparison in chapter 1. Golding, I don't know if I want to say set up, I already say set up there. I'll go metaphor. Golding plants the seeds for by plant characterization, motif, and comparison in chapter 1, Golding plants the seed for the flowering pea. That's a little too ridiculous. I'm making fun of myself right now. Yeah, that's kind of ridiculous. Let's not be ridiculous. By employing characterization, motif, and comparison in chapter 1, Golding just gets a little corny. By employing characterization, motif, and comparison in chapter 1, Golding sets the foundation clearly one's capacity for evil is the difference. Oh, I like what I'm learning. By employing characterization, motif, and comparison in chapter 1, Golding sets the foundation for the theme that seeing that the difference, I wouldn't normally be writing this big, but it's just so you guys can see. So I'm going to just scoot it down over here. That the difference between an adult and a child is the ability to see clearly one's own capacity for evil. All right. I just switched around the order here. I think it just reads a little better. By employing characterization, motif, and comparison in chapter 1, Golding sets the foundation for the theme that the difference between an adult and a child is the ability to see clearly one's own capacity. That's super wordy. By employing characterization, motif, and comparison in chapter 1, I'm just going to say Golding begins to argue the difference between an adult, begins to argue that the difference between an adult and a child is the ability to see clearly one's own capacity for evil. All right, that's better. It got too wordy. And well, you can't like sit and make every sentence perfect because you just don't have time for that. If there is one sentence that you want to make sure is crystal clear and not wordy, it's the thesis, right? Because the thesis is like the pulse of the paper. If the thesis is off, then the rest of the time I'm like, but wait, you said you were going to prove this, but that's not what you're proving, right? You got to have the thesis on. So, what does a good plan entail? I've articulated what I'm proving in each body paragraph. I've worded it in a way where I'm like, yeah, that can be the first sentence of that body paragraph, right? So that's done, ready to go. I've got goals, right? I'm not saying talk about comparisons. I'm saying what the comparison does, right? And how it eventually sort of contributes to the theme. I've thought about the relationship between these and the relationship between each and theme. I definitely know that I'm answering all parts of the prompt because I've marked up the prompt, I've thought about it, even how I planned it. I like sort of made space for half, that half, this half to make sure that I'm answering all parts of it. I've got my examples ready to go, right? So you got to make sure examples are part of your plan. Yeah. I'm feeling pretty good about this essay. Does that feel like it's going to be a pretty good essay? So what's really important about planning is that you're kind of getting all the content down. So now when I actually write, I can think about clarity and precision and sentence variation. I can think about those things now because I already know what I'm going to say. I already know what I'm setting out to prove. And that's the thing, is if you don't plan to try to figure out what you're going to prove at the same time that you're trying to articulate it clearly, it's just too much. It's like it's too many balls to juggle at once. So now I've juggled half my balls, right? And like they're ready to go. And now I can put those balls down, and now I can juggle the other half of the balls of what makes good writing, right? Sort of at the sentence level. Questions? Yeah?
Are you going to have enough time to finish by then?
Well, part of the reason why, there's a couple things, right? So part of it was, I can think a lot faster than I can speak. So the whole process was slowed down quite a bit. If I were you, I would probably give myself 50 minutes, assuming you don't have extended time. I would use about 15 minutes to plan. Once you get your plan down, everything else goes really quickly.
You said 15
15 minutes?
I would use about 15 minutes to plan. I think the hard part is students think that planning is a waste of time, and they're like, but I don't have time to plan. You don't have time not to plan, right? Like if you've got timed writing, you've got to plan it out, because you don't have time to figure it out. You can't cut and paste when you have to handwrite the essay, right?
Handwrite or hand type?
Is it handwrite?
You handwrite it unless you have computer, unless you're cleared to use a computer like on SATs. Like unless you have a learning plan that says they must use a computer, you are handwriting this. Questions about planning?
Oh,
Yes.
So, you know how you said you were like marking up the prompt and you were going and you were like listing all of your ideas? And there, are we gonna have the prompt on a separate sheet of paper as what we're gonna use to write so we can do what you just did?
What you'll do is you'll come in and I give you the prompt, and it'll be face down on the desk, and then I'll say, okay, you may begin, and you flip it over and you use like a stack of your own lined loose leaf
Okay.
paper.
Okay.
So what I would say is don't come in with 2 pieces of paper. Come in with like a bunch of paper, so
Okay.
that if you write big or you just get like, this is not a nice neat plan, right? You guys like to say outline. To me, this isn't an outline. It's a really good plan. I don't have Roman numerals. I don't have letters. That's all very cute and neat. But what we're interested in is getting quality, insightful ideas. And then when you turn in your essay, you will also turn in your plan. You can't leave the room with anything having to do with your test. So you can bring as much paper as you want.
Do you want, when we do it tomorrow, do you want us to skip a line? Like when we're writing?
Double space?
Yeah, just
No.
space. Okay,
The test is Friday, but no,
Sorry, Friday.
don't skip lines.
okay.
Yeah.
Are you gonna grade the outline?
Nope.
Because- Okay.
It's just
So
for
I don't
us.
have to like.
It's
I don't
just
have
to
to-
make sure
okay.
that.
It's one of those where like,
Handwriting.
it's more of, if the essay's really rough, I can tell whether you planned or not. But if you turn in your plan, I can at least tell you, what are you not doing in your plan that you need to start
Okay.
doing, right? So like this in and of itself is not enough. I've gotta have the examples figured out, right? And this in and of itself is not enough. Because I haven't articulated my points clearly, nor have I articulated my thesis, right? Like you need all of it. So if you look at the plan that you did for today, right? I asked you to look at this prompt and plan it out. Look at your plan. What do you need to start asking yourself that you're not currently asking yourself, based on what I've come up with and sort of what you've witnessed today as I try to do sort of a think aloud here? What do you need to start doing in your planning process? Is it that you are writing topics and saying, I'm going to talk about comparison rather than articulating the point in your plan? Is it that you're not thinking about how the 3 paragraphs relate to each other? Is it that you sort of completely ignored the second half of the question and you never got to the idea of how does this all connect to a theme? Right? Look right now. This is the improvement part. So now that you've seen how a more experienced writer can plan, and not that this is the only way, but the planning in and of itself, like what makes a good plan, that's pretty standard. And it has nothing to do with Roman numerals. So look, right now. The answer is not change my topic to look exactly like Miss Gellin's. This is not about that. Again, there's a number of ways to answer this question well. It's not like there's one right answer. It's about responding directly to the prompt. It's about supporting your points, articulating those points clearly, thinking about the relationship between those points. That's what it's about. So look at your plan. Did you do that? What steps do you need to start taking in your planning process so that it comes out closer to something like this? Because now, to me, writing that essay is going to be cake. because I've done the hard part.